And so it was that on April the 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson delivered his war message to Congress. The Senate passed a war resolution against Germany by a vote of 82 to 6, and in the House, that same resolution passed by a vote of 373 to 50. The United States officially entered the so-called Great War on April the 6th of 1917, and the impact that America's entrance into World War I had on the home front was almost immediate. For starters, the federal bureaucracy expanded. New agencies such as the Council of National Defense managed state and federal efforts to coordinate America's preparedness for the war. Then there was the creation of new federal agencies such as the War Industry Board, or the WIB. The War Industry Board was responsible for diverting materials here domestically, here at home, or in marshaling those resources, all in an effort to make sure that the United States had the fighting resources that it needed to be successful in waging the war in Europe. Many would consider this agency to actually be the most important bureaucracy in all of World War I. Led by Jewish financier Bernard Barak, the WIB exercised unprecedented power over industries by setting prices, allocating scarce materials, and standardizing products and prices to ensure efficiency. The WIB would promote the interests of the American business community by having antitrust laws temporarily suspended, which guaranteed huge profits for American corporations. Then there was the Railway Administration. The Railway Administration happened to be led by Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law, William McAdoo. And it was responsible or tasked with the responsibility of operating the nation's railways on a unified basis, allowing for a more efficient system for transporting goods and labor across this vast country. Next, there was the Food Administration, led by future President Herbert Hoover, who proved to be an able administrator. He persuaded millions of Americans to accept wheatless and meatless days so that the Food Administration would have the food that it would need to feed the troops and our foreign allies. There was the National War Labor Board, which guaranteed the rights of labor to collectively bargain and for unions to organize unimpeded. The Labor Board encouraged the improvement of working conditions through higher wages and shorter hours, and these developments all but stopped labor agitation during the war. In terms of financing the war, the government sold Liberty bonds to the public, and it would also institute a federal progressive tax structure in the years of 1917 and 1918, in which incomes, corporate profits, and wealthy estates were taxed as a means to raise revenue to support the American war effort. As for the social consequences of wartime, here we see a mixed bag for both women and African Americans. On the one hand, labor shortages were created by thousands of men vacating their jobs to serve in the military, and the positions that they left behind were filled by women and blacks. This dynamic helped women reformers to realize one of its long-standing goals, which happened to be women's suffrage, and this would finally be granted by way of the 19th Amendment, which was ratified in the year of 1920. It turns out that women's presence in the paid workforce, the outside of the home workforce, would be something that would hasten the development of voting rights for women. For blacks, Wartime work opportunities led to the Great Migration, which was the largest internal migration of Americans in all of American history. Here we see millions of African Americans leaving the rural South where there was little opportunity, few rights, and no hope, and relocating to points northward where all the wartime industrial jobs were located. And this movement often doubled and tripled the black populations of such cities as Chicago and Detroit. Well, this huge influx of blacks into areas previously scarcely populated by African Americans led to an increase in racially inspired violence, especially race riots. One of the worst of these occurred in East St. Louis in July of 1917, when an angry white mob murdered at least 39 African Americans. In a private briefing, President Wilson was advised that what had been done to blacks in northern race riots such as East St. Louis was worse than anything that Germans had done to any of their European foes. Well, when the United States entered the war, the Allied military position was dire. And what the Allies needed most were men, men, and more men. The United States obliged by passing the Selective Service Act in May of 1917, and this would establish conscription, also known as the draft. The first American troops landed in France in June of 1917 under the direction of General John J. Pershing. The influx of American troops helped to tip the balance of the war in the Allied favor. Wilson agreed to commit 15,000 troops to Russia when its provisional government collapsed in the wake of the so-called October Revolution of 1917. A communist-led coup engineered by Vladimir Lenin toppled what the United States recognized as a czarist regime in Russia, thereby basically creating a war within a war. This politically volatile situation would result in the creation of a new country, the Soviet Union, which would be a country that the United States would be at odds with for the better part of the 20th century, as we will discuss in later lessons. As this map shows, the United States entered the side of the Allies alongside the British, the French, the Russians, and several other countries. The Central Powers consisted primarily of Germany and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, along with their respective colonies in Asia and Africa. World War I really ushered in a new era, a modern era in warfare, both in terms of strategy and technology. Trench warfare was a particularly brutal feature of World War I, and World War I would also witness the introduction of modern weaponry and warfare technology. Now, I've included links for two brief videos on the next slide that I would like for you to click on both of these links and watch the short videos that you will be led to. These videos are very short. They're only about 3 minutes apiece. One is a feature on trench warfare during World War I, and the other is a video talking or discussing the advancement in weaponry and other forms of technology during World War I. I would like for you to watch them and rejoin this presentation when you have.